Okay, you've heard a lot about future research today on the individual species, et cetera, and I'm not going to go into any individual species. You've heard it as you read the report. Every chapter is going to have some suggestions for future research. What I want to do today is to talk about some of the more overarching changes in research that we need from our committee's point of view. So it's something that's really applicable across the species, and we decided to pick 5. We could have picked 50, but we picked 5, and so I'll describe those. But from a challenge point of view, and thinking about, kind of what really we have to do to get into the future, we all know that the performance compositional changes of poultry has changes rapidly over time due to genetics and nutritional changes and management changes. We also know that there's more management types nowadays. We've got organic, we've got intensive, extensive, on and on and on. There's also many more markets than there used to be. There's also the introduction by governments of having to worry about the environment or wanting to learn about the environment, which is something that's going to be forced down our throats. I'm from California. I know this for a fact. It happens. It doesn't always happen logically or based on data, but it happens. There's also some critical knowledge gaps in poultry, which has been pointed out. One of them, for example, energy. Energy is an awful important nutrient, and if we can't do a good job estimating energy requirements and reproducibly estimating the energy content of ingredients, we can't do much. The other issue is that it's been 30 years since the last report, and we'll be lucky if it's 30 years to the next report. So we have to think about that too, and that entered our thinking in our minds. So we picked out these areas of research that we thought were important. And they're more or less they're in my order of importance. I'm not sure the committee would all agree with me, but it's my order of importance. Modeling, we've talked about that today, a lot today. Dr. Sakamura is going to have a talk on that next. Research to support the modeling, because you can't model without good data. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in a second. Energy, that's been beat to death today. Environmental impacts, I'll talk about that. And then feed restrictions and breeders, which Rose talked about. It's a black box for the most part, and we got to attack that because animal welfare is going to catch up with us and start smearing us if we don't. So let's start with modeling, and I'll say we're starting from behind the 8 ball. We're far behind. The beef, sheep, dairy, beef, and swine committees all have models, operational models that are on the USDA's website. They're up and running. People are using them. They're helpful. In poultry, we have very little. So we have to catch up. The models that were developed by these other committees, they were developed by teams. And for each committee, they had at least 3 people on those committees, on the NASM committees, that were modelers. And we were understaffed on modeling. So we weren't able to make as much progress as we would like. With Dr. Sakamura's help, we did some, but we have a long way to go. The models are being continually improved for those other species. They're made public, and we need to follow their lead. So just a little history. Rob Gauss, who many of you might know, he was one of the first to make models publicly available for poultry. NILVA sort of took over the lead, the baton, and continued on. They did awesome work. It needs to be continued. It needs to be expanded. We need a lot more people working on it. We need better data. It needs to be financially supported by funding agencies and industry. And the reason we have this chapter, which is actually a new chapter for our poultry NRCs, is that we want to get the attention of the federal bureaucracy, because that's where the big money is. And they do read these reports. So hopefully this will give them a little hook in their mouth. The future models should allow the nutritionists to obtain optimal requirements for energy, digestible amino acids, calcium, phosphorus, and other nutrients of concern for all important bird strains, production goals, and management conditions. and using the data that's going to be developed. That's the goal. And they should be based on research done specifically for parameterizing such models, which is different than the research that we're doing now to determine requirements. Requirement research is, as Bill pointed out, you do broken lines, graded levels of the nutrient, you get an upslope, you get a plateau, and you see where they meet. But that's not very useful for anybody that's doing modeling. They need data on things like composition of not just the bird, but the composition of the bird in whole, the bird's feathers, the bird's organs, the bird's meat, all that sort of stuff. And there's surprisingly little of that out there. They also need energy contents of all those things. Also, the beef and dairy models, which are leading the way, they have a strong support or a foundation based on metabolic aspects, and they call it mechanistic models. That's based on things like nutrient flux rates among tissues, turnover rates within tissues, time-specific accretion rates, excretion rates, on and on and on. And they've run lots of experiments to get this, and that provides some of the underlying foundations to look at, to build in things like what happens with stress, what happens during different stages of lactation, for example, and they also have effects of hormones on some of these processes, so they can look at, so they can integrate in hormonal changes to that approach. So we should follow their lead. That's not something we should do first. First, we should do things like body composition, egg composition, et cetera. So eventually, we should have a transition from the empirical studies to use modeling for determining requirements, and beyond that, we should start thinking about doing some of the more mechanistic approaches to provide us a better foundation. And the thinking is, if we do that, we get that information, we can do it for new genetics, because we'll know how the relationship between growth rate and requirements, for example. And we can do it for different management styles. That research will be needed, but we can do it. And that'll make it more green, because these things are always going to change. And there's always going to be more and more ways of producing poultry. And so we're hoping that the models can fix that problem. And I think in pigs, they've had pretty good success with that. And the pigs were the last group that kind of came into the modeling world, but they've gotten now that there's models now, and I urge you to go to the NANP website and look at some of these models. You can put in your desired rate of growth, your desired carcass composition, your desired management systems, et cetera, and it spits out requirements that are probably better than just guessing. And so they've had pretty good feedback on that, and they just started this effort about 10 years ago. We also need additional work on calcium and phosphorus, and modeling calcium and phosphorus, and not just empirical studies, and additionally other nutrients in the long run. And as I mentioned before, we need to put it on a good mechanistic basis, and additionally we need biochemists and chemists that can work with stable isotopes to start looking at these physiological aspects, like flux rates to the breast versus flux rates to the thigh versus flux rates to the liver, et cetera. And again, they've done a lot of this in dairy cattle. Now, they started about 30 years ago. And of course, all this is going to require funding. Okay, the next is energy value of feedstuffs, which I'm going to go through pretty fast because Gonzalo did an excellent job talking about this and poking holes at everything. And I put some slides together to repeat that, but there's no need for me to repeat it. Because that's really all, those first two slides are kind of a repeat of what he said. But again, I think knowing energy concentrations in diets is fundamental to all diet formulation, and knowing it in ingredients is even more important. Given the use of dietary energy for poultry, establishing a valid consensus methodology and reporting requirements should be a near-term priority. I think Gonzalo said this too, but I want to re-emphasize that. And it's possible that, as Gonzalo brought up, that we should be starting to move away from TME to AME and eventually maybe to NE systems. But there's some debate about this, and we need to do the right experiments to sort this out. And again, I think that needs to be soon. That's not a long-term goal. That should be a short-term goal. The last one, or the second to last one, is environmental impacts and sustainable, sustainability. This is the first talk I've given in over a year, so I'm kind of hammering around, and I haven't taught a class in 2 years. Sustainability of poultry. Minimizing the environmental effects of poultry production is going to require us to utilize the ingredients that have the lowest impact on the environment when we think about the various things of concern, like carbon dioxide, phosphorus, nitrogen. And we can help by identifying poultry feeding contributions to lifetime costs, lifetime pollution costs of each ingredient for problems of concern, again, nitrogen, phosphorus, and greenhouse gases. And ultimately, this research should inform models, again, and software developers on the integration of nutrient constraints based on lifetime pollution cost of these things. And that's already happening to a large extent. It's especially in California, it's happening really fast for dairy. Because dairy, they now are taxed on CO2 emission. And they can get carbon credits for reducing it. And many of the dairies in California make more money off their carbon credits than they do off their milk. So ultimately, the research that we do on this thing should be to inform models again, so the software developers, et cetera, and the model developers have the right information. Because right now we do a lot of the measuring things, et cetera, but it's really not what the modelers need. So some of the solutions, maximizing the efficiency of use of the ingredients that we feed the bird is always going to be important. We've been trying to do that all along, and we've done a pretty good job increasing the efficiency utilization of nitrogen and phosphorus. We don't know about carbon dioxide. But it hinges on increasing ingredient digestibility, bioavailability for all the pollutants of concern, and accurately knowing the requirements. Because if we don't know the requirements accurately, you got to put a large margin of safety on there, and you're really increasing the problem, not decreasing it. So again, getting those requirements nailed down is really going to be important. And again, knowing energy and calcium and phosphorus and feed ingredients so that we can match the levels in the diet to the requirements more accurately. Some people call that precision nutrition, is always going to be important. So a lot of what we're doing now, I think, is really helping on the sustainability side. But again, it's not always done in a way that can help inform the models that are going to be needed to integrate that into least cost nutrient formulation programs to meet the standards that the government's going to be forcing on us. And again, in California, that's happening, especially in the dairy industry, but in the beef industry too. I'm sure it'll come to the poultry industry. Okay, another thing that is important for sustainability is having better research on the older animals. Right now, well, I'll just speak for myself. I'm lazy, and it's a hell of a lot easier to work on a baby chick in the first 2 weeks than it is to work on a finishing animal. So we have our best stuff for the period of the animal's life where it has the least impact on the environment. And we have our worst stuff for the period of life when they have the most effect. So we got to reverse that. And I think if we start looking for funding from the federal government to reverse that and get money for the older stages, they might be receptive, because this is the government's, USDA's #1 concern right now. If they're going to come up with new money for us to do our research that we want to do, maybe for other purposes, that's where you're going to find it. It also requires attention to the entire production cycle, including, well, this is sort of repetitive, but it also should include the breeder periods, where we have a lot of losses there because we know very little about requirements. And again, the research should be designed to support that modeling, because again, if we don't integrate it in a way that it can be used by nutritionists as part of their least cost programming, it's not going to get used. So we have to get it out in the field. The last area is feed restriction and broiler breeders or breeders of all the poultry species. It's the area we know the least about. Rosemary gave a really nice talk on that. Right now, we know what we need to put into practice, but we don't know how to get there. And so I think one approach is to do more research on the fundamentals, the fundamental biology that underlines how appetite's controlled, and the hormones that control it, et cetera. And there's a little bit of work out there, but mostly it's dried up. A lot of this fundamental physiology work is just not getting done anymore. There's no funding, and nobody's getting trained in it. So we need new money for that. To start looking at it, then we could maybe work with the geneticist and start coming up with ways to separate this problem of over-consuming and having to babysit them on their feed intake to get them to not die, as Rose says. But I don't think just randomly trying things is going to get us there. I think we have to understand the underlying physiology and biology of it, and then work from there backwards to fix it. Because we really need to fix the genetics of the bird, not try and fix it with management, because we're going to get smeared. It's starting to happen, and it's going to get worse. So with that, Dr. Sakamura.